good afternoon. I'm very excited to introduce our first speaker, Daniel Motaung. He is the founder and chairperson at Safe Content Advocacy Network, or SCAN. He is a board member at the Real Facebook Oversight Board and a research fellow at Research ICT Africa. He is an advocate for digital rights, labor activism, and the creation of a safer online environment. With a background in content moderation, he has become a prominent figure at the nexus of technology, human rights, and labor. He aims to elevate content moderation to a respected profession, ensuring standardized practices that protect both the workers behind the screens and the users that they serve. He believes in a digital future where technology aligns seamlessly with human rights, dignity, and fairness.
Hi everyone. I didn't know that there was going to be that. Could have prepared a presentation, so I'll just speak. A brief introduction into how this chapter of my life began, where I am being called a whistleblower. She just said the nice things. But generally speaking, they call me a whistleblower. I didn't have any plan to be called a whistleblower. I was just someone actually coming from, well, to those who don't know, I am a South African. I come from this country. From a very poor part of South Africa, Free State, an area called Qwaqwa. I was looking for a job briefly after university. And so I found a job in Nairobi, Kenya, at SAMA, a company called SAMA Source. And that is how this chapter of my life began. That job was, well, I thought it was a flashy job. I thought it was going to be an interesting job because it was for Facebook. I was going to work as a content moderator. I didn't even know what content moderation was at the time. Yes, I was coming from university, but I still didn't know what content moderation was at the time. So I take the job, was flying for the first time, get to Kenya. For the first time in my life, I was told I am useless. And this I was told by the executives at SAMA. They were telling me that I'm useless in relation to when I was saying to them that their work processes and what they expected out of me actually subjected me to exploitation, pain, and suffering. And I was saying, well, let's sit down and have a conversation about this work process, and let's try and find a way of making sure that this pain and or suffering that I'm suffering or experiencing, rather, English, does not kill me in the end. They decided to fire me. Little did I know that this content moderation thing that I was doing was actually me providing training data for what we call artificial intelligence, which, if things go well, and I think they are going well, should be able to replace me in the end as a content moderator, right? And so essentially content moderation, I, as a content moderator, whatever content that people post on social media platform, I interpret it and then I train AI, or I use the data, provide the data to AI so as to teach it how to moderate similar content in the future, because essentially that's how AI works. Whether you are annotating data or you are a content moderator, you're doing that. You are basically making decisions in simulation so that AI can do the same thing in the future without needing human assistance. And because one of the biggest questions that I have to deal with regards to content moderation, since I'm saying that content moderation is dangerous, toxic, and subjected me to pain and suffering, and by that I mean PTSD, because I'm actually recovering from PTSD as I stand here because of content moderation. This I discovered after the fact of me being fired. I discovered that I was suffering from anxiety, depression, and PTSD. And because one of the biggest questions I have to deal with in doing the work that I do, whereby I'm saying, let's make content moderation better. Or before I continue, I just do want to say that I'm going to use the word content moderation a lot. But when you think about the things that I'm saying, think about them in the context of the impact of artificial intelligence in general on human life, not necessarily the impact of content moderation per se. And I'm saying this because ChatGPT, I believe the company is OpenAI, basically contracted Sama, the very same company that I was working for the purposes of training data. And the same thing happened to people who are providing this training data. They suffered from PTSD, anxiety, or whatever, and all the other mental health problems that you can imagine. So the similarity is that all the training data that human beings provide for AI training purposes actually subjects us as human beings to pain and suffering, which might be interpreted in a lot of ways. Whether you can say you end up with anxiety or depression or whatever, but it subjects us to something. And some people actually try to attempt suicide. I know of people who have actually attempted suicide, and I know of people who have committed suicide because of the same. So this beautiful thing that is AI does something to human beings in the process of us actually training it. Now, I was saying, because one of the biggest questions that I have to deal with is, if the work that we do in training AI, because right now, actually, I think AI has some capacity or ability to actually do the work that we do. Not perfect, right? Because now, if we really, in the bigger scheme of things, AI has, I think one commentator says that AI has a world view of a 4-year-old. So that is hardly something that we can say we have, okay, it has achieved the status of human intelligence that we can rely on as human beings. But we do have to accept that AI has a lot of capacity, especially in moderating content, for instance, that it can actually even replace human beings. But now, one of the biggest questions that I have to answer, I think I'm saying this for the 4th time maybe, is if content moderation and all AI-related work that we do in the Global South, it's done mostly in the Global South, in Africa, the Philippines, and whatnot. If this work is so toxic and so problematic, then why is it that we are fighting to keep the jobs? As well, my comrades in Kenya and elsewhere, they are fighting to keep the job. And I speak so that they can keep their jobs. Why? Well, my answer is simple, but before I get to the answer, I want to make a case study. I don't know how many of you know of a company called ISCO. And here I'm talking about the third industrial revolution scenario, not the fourth, because the fourth we are talking about this artificial intelligence. I'm talking about the third industrial revolution scenario. ISCO, well, it was a parastatal in the country. It used to specialize with, or in steel. Before democracy, it used to employ about 60,000 people, a little over 60,000 people. Then came the third industrial revolution where everything, factories were mechanized. And then what happened was that human beings were replaced by robots, which were then operated by a few human beings. We are not at the stage whereby these things can operate themselves, which is the fourth industrial revolution, where cars drive themselves and. What then happened was that a company that used to, well, now it's called ArcelorMittal, actually. What happened was that shortly after coming into democracy in '94, ISCO ended up employing less than 20,000 people, right? What does that mean? That meant that most of the people who were working back then became unemployed, right? And what the fourth industrial revolution does, if we are to look at this example, is that it takes even the operational aspect of robots, whereby human beings were actually operating robots, it takes it away from them and replacing human beings. So when I answer the question, if this work is so toxic, why am I fighting, or is everyone fighting to keep this so-called toxic job? Well, because if we are to accept that AI should replace, firstly, content moderators and other AI workers, then we might as well accept that AI is going to, and celebrate that AI is going to replace each and every one of us in this room. Because today, you go to a university, you get given an assignment, you go to ChatGPT, you punch in your question, your assignment question, and voila, you get your assignment. Some of us, okay, not me, some of us have to do research. I've forgotten the name of this AI software. What it does is that it writes your research for you, and it even references the thing for you, right? Someone on the other side, or on the other side of the world, of course, is trying to design a system whereby it can detect anything that has been done or written by AI, but I don't think they are doing a very good job at it. And in any case, if you were to take that thing to court, I think you would win. And I'm saying this because if I'm doing research and then my research gets rejected because another AI said my job is not, or my work rather, is not authentic and all of those things, well, I might as well challenge that in court because it is threatening my livelihood and future. But anyways, I'm not there. The point I'm making is that the reason that we are fighting is because, one, we need to understand, first of all, that this work can be made safer and fairer, which is what I'm trying to do in my work and my research. And the bigger problem that I'm experiencing is that, or coming across, is that the powers that be, corporate companies and even government to a certain extent, do not want to accept that there is actually a solution to this, or that AI can be made fairer and AI can be made to serve people as opposed to take our purpose of life away. Because if we say or accept that AI is going to replace us at a certain time, then we might as well have accepted that AI has taken away our purpose of life in the bigger scheme of things. Because why do we exist? I'm not a philosopher. But we exist to work, right? If we stop working, if we stop research or doing any other type of work that you can think of, whether it's journalism, whether you're a lawyer or whatever, and we are going to allow AI, and I'm saying lawyering because I once read an article that said that a certain lawyer, I think in America, instead of doing their work, they actually went online and then I think they got a legal opinion from this thing or something, yeah, and then submitted the thing. The reality is such that this thing will advance to a point whereby it is actually able to do that without detection, because it keeps on advancing and getting better and better. Now, should we celebrate AI? I don't think we should not celebrate AI, but at the same time, I don't think we should be celebrating it to an extent that we accept it as something that is good for us, that is basically, or that should replace us, because no one is interested or having the conversation in saying, how do we deal with artificial intelligence in this day and age whereby we do not accept that we should be replaced by AI. I once sent what do they call this, to the Communications Portfolio Committee, that's South African Parliament. I once sent, I've forgotten what they call this, but I was essentially asking them to give me an ear whereby I will be speaking about the effects of content moderation on not necessarily human beings in general, but on their constituency, South Africans who are in Kenya and being exploited. No one was interested in having that conversation. In fact, I haven't even gotten a response up until this point. In Kenya, when government was supposed to at least call us, because we had a case and submitted our complaints to government with regards to Sama and Meta, instead of them calling us and saying, well, what sort of problems are you experiencing? And or even investigating as to whether the allegations that we're making about the two companies were true or not. They decided, well, we're not going to do that, but rather they were going to oppose us in court. That's what they did. So we find ourselves in a situation whereby there's, okay, don't get me wrong. Let me just say this first. Artificial intelligence is a beautiful thing. I am not here to say that AI is a bad thing. And when I speak, wherever I speak, and when I do what I do, I am not declaring artificial intelligence as the enemy. No, that's not what I'm doing. But what I'm doing is rather, how can we make sure that AI works for all of us instead of subject some of us to pain and suffering? And in the end, how do we ensure that this AI, it is not over-celebrated to an extent whereby it replaces us as human beings and therefore renders our purpose of life as something that is pointless? Because if, I'm going to say again, if AI replaces all of us and does work for us, then our purpose of life goes away. You can think about this from an economic point of view. If we stop working, the entire economic system collapses. In terms of how things work, because, well, in a capitalist framework, some people have to work, some people have to work to produce things, and then some people have to buy these things, and the cycle continues. But now, if AI does all the work, takes over production, takes over the work of the intelligence, if we like, and no one is working, we are going to end up with a situation whereby human beings, all of us, we just wake up every day and we are not working. And that begs the question, where are we going to get the money to buy anything? How are we going to survive? We are not going to be able to survive. So AI is a beautiful thing, but we need to make sure that in the bigger scheme of things, AI only exists to serve humanity, and AI makes the lives of human beings easier and not more complicated. If you look at history from the beginning of time, if you look at all the modes of production, if you think about Marxism for a second, all of the transitions that have been happening, they have been happening to make life easier where production is concerned. So when once upon a time we were producing cars with bare hands, technology came and then made production a bit more easier, and cars were now being produced using robots. So hard work was now being, the hard work that human beings used to do was now being done by technology. So we need to think about artificial intelligence as something that will achieve the same thing in our lives, not as something that is going to complicate our lives and eventually replace us and render us useless. I mean, the idea of a self-driving car, I can imagine myself in one, is a beautiful idea. And the reason it's a beautiful idea for me is that it's going to reduce accidents. So if I'm in a self-driving car, the likelihood of me dying is going to basically go lower as compared to a car that's been driven by a human being who might, let's say okay, when I came here, I used the bus, right? I do not know that the driver of that bus was drunk, or I don't know whether the driver was drunk or not, right? Meaning that me entering into that bus is me risking my life, potentially, because if the driver is drunk, well, the possibility of basically an accident happening goes higher. AI is not going to be drunk, right? So it's a beautiful idea, and AI is a beautiful thing. But now we need to be able to practice AI in a manner that is responsible, in a manner that makes sure that humanity does not suffer in the end, in a manner that ensures that humanity actually benefits in the end. That is the important thing for me. And that is why content moderators and all AI workers are fighting to keep those jobs that they do, although the contention is such that that job is dangerous. The job can be safer, the job can be fairer. The only question is how can these jobs be made safer and fairer? Another contentious point that I've come across in relation to AI and making AI safer is whether or not AI can be regulated or should be regulated. There is a lot of people who will tell you that, in fact, I haven't had anyone actually argue in favor of regulation. Most people actually argue against regulation. Firstly, I argue for regulation because if I now have a solution right now, in order for this solution of mine to be implemented, the only way to do that is via regulation. It's not going to happen independently because I do not know, well, at least in a capitalist framework, of any scenario or situation whereby a capitalist organization self-regulates. And human beings in nature, I don't think, are able to basically regulate their behavior, of which is why we have all kinds of governments, even dictatorships, because we need someone to make sure that some sort of law and order is maintained in society. Hobbes says that. I didn't. And I think Hobbes is made a very good point. So it is important that we regulate. Yes, there's bad regulation, there's good regulation. We just need to find a balance. And I think AI can be regulated. The question is how. And we need to talk about also, if we are saying we're going to be regulating AI, which AI or what parts of AI do we regulate? And I'm saying this because there is something that I struggle with. I've been to some conferences, and when I get to those conferences, I hear people talking about, well, they talk about gig work, they talk about platform work, they talk about content moderation. Well, if I'm there, then you must know that they are going to speak about content moderation. So they speak about content moderation, they speak about gig work, they speak about platform work, and then they speak about people who are not necessarily working on any platform, or people who are not necessarily working on any AI systems or online, so to speak. By the way, I'm not suggesting that there's something wrong with people fighting for those struggles. No, all I'm saying is that let us not be confused about what is online, what is not online, what is AI, and what is not. Because if we are very far towards finding a solution and dealing with the problem properly. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about, there's a confusion. I've been in a conference whereby they talk about annotators and content moderators and Uber drivers. Fine, the app Uber, sure. The way I define this is that you can't say people who get their work online, get their manual work by using an online system are platform workers. Because if you do that, you are going to end up with a problem of not knowing what to regulate and how to regulate it. So the problem is, you find people talking about artificial intelligence workers and people who get their work by using online platforms and putting them in the same category or basket. And that creates a situation whereby the conversation gets murky. We no longer understand what is it that we are trying to regulate, or what it is that we are trying to fix, or what it is that we are trying to identify as a problem or as the exploitation of labor. Because now you are taking people who are working in the transport industry, although they are using the Uber app, to get their work as people who are in an AI-related industry, and that is not correct. So I think from that line, the key takeaway is that, look, let us try by all means to clearly define what is it that we need to regulate. Even when it comes to ChatGPT, we need to figure out how we are going to regulate that. And what does regulation mean? It might mean that this thing has to, because here's the thing, let us understand that this concept of generative AI, I said when I began that some commentators say that it has the worldview of a 4-year-old. In fact, a 4-year-old is better, because a 4-year-old has an independent worldview, whereby AI does not really have an independent worldview. AI can, even generative AI, I'm speaking about that right now, it can only do what it was programmed to do. It can only use what the kind of data that is available to it. A 4-year-old child is a bit different. In fact, not a bit different. A 4-year-old child is able to independently come up with things that are entirely new. Basically create things that are entirely new. AI is not able to do that. So, if we want to regulate this thing, we need to decide whether we want these companies to commit themselves to designing a system that maybe will basically provide a reference for whatever content that they generate. To say, well, in generating this material, I gathered information from 100 websites. That is a way of saying, well, sure, I've provided an answer to whatever it is that you're asking me, but do know that this thing that I've generated is not entirely my work, because what AI does, or ChatGPT, in all honesty, it goes online, it looks at different materials, and then it gathers that information, it puts it together, and then it sounds like it's new information to you. Well, it's not. It's information that was taken elsewhere. And it is important that we note that as human beings, because we cannot have a situation whereby AI is going to be given a title of saying, well, it has now created something new. I don't think that is acceptable, because all the content that this AI is now generating is actually something that it learned somewhere from human beings, in which case our importance as human beings remains. I think I had 30 minutes or something. Yeah. It's time. Okay, so in the bigger scheme of things, when I close, it is important to make sure that we do not allow artificial intelligence to replace us, human beings. The problem is, right now, as it stands, because I go to conferences, right? Well, I went to a UNESCO conference. I think this was the first time where I actually realized this. Internet for Trust. I think it was last year, I don't remember. Internet for Trust conference. When I get in Paris, people are taking pictures at the Eiffel Tower. They are supposed to be talking about the Digital Services Act. They are supposed to be talking about, well, how do we fix this? How do we regulate this AI? Do we even want to regulate? Instead, you find people taking pictures at the Eiffel Tower. Well, at the time I was frustrated, and at the peak or at the height of my PTSD, I did not take a picture at the Eiffel Tower. I was frustrated by people who are taking pictures at the Eiffel Tower, and instead of having the real conversations that we are supposed to be having, you find people having, I hate technocratic conversations. And by technocratic conversations, I'm talking about conversations whereby people are talking about technicalities and not solutions. They're not talking about, fine, technicalities are good. I'm sure there are very smart AI people in the room. Those things are very good and they're important. In fact, that is why we have AI. Remember, I was just a content moderator, and I'm doing research to find a solution to an AI-related problem. That time, I don't know anything about. Actually, I do know something about AI now. I didn't know anything about AI. But if you go to conferences or spaces like this, let us try and sit down and engage and have real conversations about what is the problem and how do we fix this. It's all good and well that you can travel, you can go to a conference, and then you can have take pictures at the Eiffel Tower or what you have, all those things. Brilliant, that is great. But let's go back to the initial, the basic reason why conferences came to exist. They were supposed to be places whereby we sit down, we engage, and maybe we take, we make some decisions, and then we make some propositions or whatever. Let them not just be places whereby we have empty conversations about things that are important and pretending that they are important, whereas when we live there, they are not really important. And what I'm saying, I believe it to be true, because when I actually expressed my frustration to someone in Paris, they said, well, I've been to many of these things. And right now, I've sort of like given up. You know, I was like you in the beginning, all fired up and all those things. But now I've come to a point whereby, well, really, I mean, you just go to them, those things, and do what you must do and then go back. And nothing changes. And I'm saying that we should sit down and engage genuinely and truthfully, because in as much as I'd like to see regulation come right now, where content moderation is concerned, I said I sent a letter to government in this country. Nothing happened. The government is not going to regulate right now. Why? Because, well, in a capitalist framework, in the bigger scheme of things, investors come first. And people like us who complain, well, come last. I write to government and say, well, I'm dying. They're like, you are dying. Well, the company that you are accusing is actually bringing billions of dollars. So, die. I think we'll talk a bit later. So they do that. So, grassroots level, what we need to do, basically, a counter movement whereby we can come up with, or maybe force the hand of the powers that be, so that a solution gets implemented. And that's my big idea. I say all content moderators and AI workers, if I can have them in one room, maybe a conference like this, and then we make a resolution, and then we take the decision that, look, we are going to force the hand of these companies to implement some of the demands that we are making to them. That will happen. I think in the context of content moderators, if we stop moderating content for one day, globally, whether it's in she wants me to go. It's in Nairobi, Kenya, or wherever. If we come together and decide, well, we are going to force the hand of these people and then force them to come to the bargaining table, we'd actually have that conversation, and then we'd make progress, and then we'd make serious advances in respect to the demands that we are making. I was fired because I tried to do that. I said, well, the only thing that I was suffering from was me not realizing that solidarity did not yet exist within my comrades. In fact, it still is lacking right now, and the movement is suffering as it stands. But I said to them, well, here's the thing. If these people, because I was suspended at the time, I said to them, look, here's the thing. If they say they're going to fire me or any one of us, we all stop working. I genuinely believe that was going to work. Oh, there was this thing, I think it was a Kwasatu thing or Satu thing. An injury to one is an injury to all type of thing. Yeah. I was thinking along those lines. And I said, well, here's the thing. If they fire one of us, we all stop working. And they seriously became afraid of that to such an extent that they brought a VP from America to come and deal with little old me. And as a result, I was fired because they threatened my co-workers. And then my co-workers, for lack of a better word, buckled under pressure. And then I was fired. And the movement is dying. Yes. I actually like questions.
We're going to do
all right.
But thank you so much.
So what do I do now? Go back?
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. So next we have Edward Ongweso, who is a Brooklyn-based writer who self-identifies as a born-again Luddite. He is currently the finance editor at Logix magazine and co-host of This Machine Kills, which is a podcast about the political economy of technological development. Previously, he has worked as an organizer and researcher focusing on how Silicon Valley's model was restructuring labor and social relations. His interests include tracing how venture capital from Silicon Valley has created monopolies that impact consumer welfare, democratic governance, and the quality of public goods and services.
everybody. Can you hear me? Give me 1 second. So initially, I was going to have a bit of a talk that was focusing on algorithmic control of platform workers, since that's one of the areas in which I focus, and thinking through whether algorithmic overseers and platforms should be designed in better ways or abolished entirely. But a colleague of mine at Logix, Ali Al-Haktib, wrote a piece called Destroy AI that I think has got me to shift what I was interested in. So today I want to talk instead about sabotage and Luddism, and thinking through the need for, I guess, a sort of flank that is interested in sabotaging or undermining computational infrastructure and introducing permanent risk and cost to the operation of computation in order for other movements to achieve their aims, either as a concession or with additive pressure being put on them. So, for reference at the top, I'll just list some of the texts I'm engaging with if you're interested in. Destroy AI by Ali Al-Haktib, who's over at Logix. Max Larson's Computer Center Sabotage, which is a paper that focuses on computer center sabotage from 1968 to 1971, and articulating how methods of sabotage were sophisticated and complex and had a great ability at linking grievances that were not immediately related to computation to movements that were interested in slowing down the accelerated computation and computerization of universities in the 60s. As well as Gavin Mueller's Breaking Things That Work, which is a great sort of Luddite history of the movement during the heyday of the Industrial Revolution, and a history of how workplace movements and resistance has been spurred by dissatisfaction at work that has led to rank and file sabotage of computational infrastructure or infrastructure for the workplace in of itself. And Andreas Malm's How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which is a survey of nonviolent resistance, but especially thinking through some of the moral impetus that demands of us property damage and destruction, and the sort of creation of this additional cost to deter some of these more destructive futures that we're hoping to organize against. I want to quote a little bit from Ali's Destroy AI piece, where he writes, I'm gravitating away from the discourse of measuring and fixing unfair algorithmic systems or making them more transparent or accountable. Instead, I'm finding myself fixating on articulating the moral case of sabotaging, circumventing, and destroying AI and machine learning systems and their surrounding political projects as valid responses to harm. In other words, I want us to internalize and develop a more rigorous appreciation of those who fuck up AI and its supporting systems. I think we must forcefully put on the table the possibility that we will destroy systems that fail to make a compelling affirmative case for their existence, and that threat must be credible. We should actively undermine and sabotage systems and recognize that labor as a moral project that we engage in the way Luddites sabotaged machinery that tore people apart. So for the talk, I want to do a few things. First, I'm going to lean pretty heavily on Max Larson's piece, because I think that it's a great summary of why in the 60s students were engaged in attempts to take over computer centers, blow them up, shut them down, and the lessons that can offer us today, or the mirrors of the parallels that it can offer us today, in thinking through a strategy that uses sabotage as a radical flank to try to impose or permanently shift incentives towards accelerating the expansion of invasive digital systems. And then I also want to use that to then kind of flesh out some of the things that were particularly successful about that strategy of sabotage that could be adopted today. The ways, like, as I said earlier, they were able to link struggles that had little to do on their face with computation to struggles that did, sharpening both of their analyses, growing the base of support, and winning concessions from these universities, as well as the strategies that developed the technology of sabotage and that also articulated well, one, pushed back against the idea that technological progress was synonymous with social progress, and articulated the ways in which disruption of technological progress might sometimes be required to achieve social progress. And that, from there, I want to then, engage a bit with Mueller and Malm to try to think about what recent nonviolent movements also can add, what recent nonviolent movements have given us in terms of the models of resistance that people follow with regards to Silicon Valley and the tech industry, and the lessons that we can draw from failures and successes. So, Larson's essay kind of starts with this New York Times article in 2015 about mathematicians who rescued this kidnapped computer. In 1970, the NYU's Current Institute for Mathematical Sciences had this 6-ton, $2 million mainframe that was being leased to them by the Atomic Energy Commission. And in 1970, 150 students stormed the building, evacuated the staff, took control of it. And their demands were that the university pay $100,000 in bail funds to the Panther 21, a group of 21 Black Panthers who had been arrested and accused of planning to attack and bomb police stations and office buildings in New York City, and who were eventually acquitted when it was revealed that the infiltrators in the organization were the ones who spurred along that plot. So these kidnappers took over the building and the computer for 2 days, and when ransom wasn't paid, they left. And so mathematicians came in and they discovered they weren't able to access the room, and so they tried to peek through, and they saw that there were jugs of napalm covering the mainframe and that there was a live fuse connected to the napalm that was going in, and so they quickly scrambled to get a fire extinguisher and put out the live fuse and save the computer. Now, the article itself, despite these being pretty high stakes, doesn't really offer more than a sentence trying to think through why they might have done this, why they might have tried to blow up a building for bail funds for Black Panthers. And the explanation given is that they were angry about the Vietnam War and the shootings at Kent State, and that in the 60s, and this age of rebellion, students were unsatisfied and angry, and so, of course, they would occupy a building and threaten to destroy a multi-million-dollar piece of equipment for bail funds. But as this essay kind of fleshes out, this is unsatisfactory for a lot of reasons, and is part of a larger effort to try to depoliticize sabotage, which in of itself is a political move to try to insist that doing it is a foolish task, or doing it goes up against ethical, moral principles or commitments we have elsewhere, that it's too dangerous or that's too unruly. And so Larson starts to look at alternative explanations for why students might risk their freedom and might risk destroying a building for Black Panthers or for a totally different struggle that doesn't seem to be related to computation. And one explanation that's proposed is that there's a wave of militant resistance in the 1960s that is connected to the accelerated adoption of computation that's being spearheaded in part by the Pentagon. And so anti-war resistance is blossoming at the places where the computerization is thriving, at the universities, at engineering departments, at computer science departments, at places where there are pipelines routing people directly into the heart of US empire. And that the computer ends up becoming synonymous with warmongering, with imperialism, with state power, with technocratic rule that is prioritizing interests and ends that are antagonistic to the publics, to the students and to the general populations as well. And computers become the symbol because they're augmenting the ability to engage in social control and repression, in violence overseas, in warmongering. And this is the reason why they come under the aim of students at NYU and elsewhere. But if this is the case, then it follows, as Larson asked, that they should have you would expect them to put different claims or different demands forward. They would have asked for the ROTC to be dismantled instead of asking for bail funds for Black Panthers. So why is it that they risked so much for the Black Panthers themselves? And so he points to a newsletter, December 1970 newsletter by Joan Dublin and the Computer People for Peace, that highlights how over the 1950s and 60s, NYU had become a major landholder in Greenwich Village and began swallowing up neighborhoods that were classified as slums thanks to Robert Moses's renewal program. And that these land grabs had been pushing out thousands and thousands of residents over the past decade. And that the final straw leading up to the escalation and the occupation of that building was a land grab partnership with Bellevue Hospital that dislocated thousands of residents, but then erected research and training programs that had nothing to do with the primary care of the local community. And so, as Dublin writes, the university had gone too far in usurping community property and in failing to consider the requirements of students, residents, and workers in the area. And so, this dovetails also with the fact that NYU students were already an active and kind of militant organization or student body, and that in the community they had already been engaged in union drives and rent strikes and open admission demonstrations. And so in the month leading up to the takeover, we start to see picketing, boycotting of classes. We start to see occupying of elevators and of cafeterias, and kind of the blossoming of the tradition of community engagement mixing and linking with struggles to bring some measure of justice or racial justice, specifically with the union drives and with the open admission strategy here. And the movement begins to settle on the computer, circulating flyers that articulate why it's a valuable and reasonable hostage. The flyers read, New York University has been oppressing the Black and brown people in New York through its racist admission policies, through a health complex that gives totally inadequate care to the people of the Lower East Side, and through their real estate holdings in Lower New York City. And so this computer becomes a tool of oppression. And they go on to add in the flyer, NYU must begin reparations to the Black community by paying the bail of Black Panther leaders now being held in New York. But they will not pay it if we just ask. NYU does not want the Panthers on the streets fighting for Black community. They will only pay if they feel a real threat. Our hold on the computer is that threat. And so Larson kind of says that, what this shows us is that the computational infrastructure becomes a target because it represents, quote, a set of intellectual, ideological, and financial investments that the university could not afford to ignore. And so even though the computer is not explicitly involved in the reason why the Panthers were targeted by conspiracy and put to jail, even though it's not immediately involved in why Bellevue Hospital has this land grab that pushes out thousands of residents, even though it's not immediately involved in the real estate land grabs that the university has been doing as it's been growing and expanding in Greenwich Village, that they were able to link the computer as a tool of oppression in of itself and the role that it played in state power and social control and repression to the university's own bid to ignore the public demands for a fairer campus or for more consideration for the community. And so by seizing the computer, you end up demonstrating just how important your aims are, right? That this computer is a counterweight or a stand-in for the value of your ask, because you can't ignore it. And so Larson then goes on to try to argue and articulate why sabotage in that period seemed to have a lower barrier to entry for a wide range of people. Between 1968 and 1971, there were at least 27 instances of computer center sabotage on North American university campuses. There were 10 attempts to destroy computational infrastructure and equipment, and then 17 forcible occupations and shutdowns. And in 1970, you had Computer World heralding the year as a year of crisis for data processing because of a string of arson, and as they articulated, they invoked a string of arson, of bombings, of invasions, of occupations, alongside, Larson writes, a string of hurricanes, floods, and heat waves, as if sabotage were no less natural than weather. And so so the constant threat and the realization of a real cost or a real risk starts to scare the industry itself, but it also starts to apply pressure through to the institutions themselves, and as we'll talk about later, it results in some big wins for a bunch of these campaigns. But at the time, the saturation of sabotage is starting to be regarded as cliche, or there are attempts to reason through it as this is just a blip in the radar, right? That the sabotage is predictable because these activists hate computers, because they're Luddites, pejoratively, and that they can't accept the march of history, that their historical relevance, they're being left behind by computerization and digitization, they're disaffected, their opposition is can be read by critics as rational in a very narrow sense, but fundamentally irrational because it's getting in the way of progress and of technological progress and of digitization. And because they're malcontent since the society no longer needs them in this technocratic age. We see another development emerge with the ascension, Larson points out, of the Berkeley free speech movement, which kind of not only marks the first mass adoption of sit-ins and direct action on North American college campus, but it also is one that shifts the mode of analysis to the university itself. And instead of solely focusing on specific wars or specific acts of exploitation in workplaces with student workers or with community workers or racial injustice or outright racism, the protests are focusing on how the university system is a dehumanizing system itself, and that it is a key midwife of capitalism. It's integral to preserving and expanding imperialism, and that it is a site of racism constantly. And that without the university, these systems would be in a crisis of their own. And so here we start to see FSM relying on metaphors and on actions that settle on pieces of computational infrastructure that are readily, that people regularly encounter in their day-to-day. Specifically, they settle on the IBM cards. These punch cards are recognizable among the student body in a way that computers are not, because they're still relatively rare. And as a result, they use them, they burn them, they use pranks with them where they register non-existent students, they burn logos into them, or they punch logos into them. They are able to galvanize and consolidate criticism of the university and of all the entanglement it has in immoral endeavors to the IBM card, because they're also trying to speak about the alienation that students might feel going to and attending and working in a university that is involved in these sort of enterprises. And so this raises the, this symbolic point of attack, as Larson puts it, becomes integral, right? Where it is used in conjunction with the sit-ins that they do. It is used in conjunction with the walkouts they do, with the demonstrations, with the rallies, trying to emphasize the role that that computer systems, that digital systems are having in the moral ends that they're opposing, right? And why sabotage needs to focus on the systems that these cards are just one of the many visible appendages of. Another example is instructive here that Larson looks at is the Sir George Williams University incident, right? Where on January 29th, 1969, there's an occupation that lasts until February 11th, when the police riot police raid the building and put an end to the occupation. But in the process, the students smash the computers with an axe, they start a fire, and then they throw the records outside of the windows, and that's the act that actually costs the university real manpower because of the hours that are spent putting information on these records. But the motives behind the occupation of the computer center begin and go back to 1968, where 6 West Indian students accused one of the biology professors of assigning black students lower grades than white students. And they bring it up to the university ignores their demands, establishes a hearing, the black students object to the inclusion of certain committee members. This leads to disputes, more ignored demands, sit-ins, demonstrations, until finally they decide to take the computer center. But why the computer center itself? They take the computer center not because they're scared of computerization, they're not scared of these digital systems, but they take it, again, because it's a valuable hostage, because they understand how valuable it is to a wide variety of the university's interest. As Larson writes, it's maintained by a team of 20 people who employed it in a range of activities, including payroll, accounting, scheduling, faculty research, and computer science coursework. And that it likely cost the university about $1,000 per hour to rent and operate, right? And so the demonstrators here believe that if they can take control of the computer, they can bring the university to a screeching halt, and that if they can do this, then they can force them to the negotiating table and win some measure of racial justice concessions from the university. They also wanted to pursue this strategy because it's a strategy where they were interested in making sure no one got hurt. There was no loss of life. They didn't believe that the police would get called in. They felt safe with the computer, as one of the occupiers put it, because of the value that it had to the university. And again, they only occupied and engaged in the sabotage once all their grievances and demands from previous issues had been ignored and exhausted, and all the courses of response were exhausted. And this is important to consider, again, because we see constantly in these examples, especially in this one, we're seeing students who are interested in racial justice, students who are interested in housing, students who are interested in racism and diversity and admission policies, students who are interested or are concerned with financial aid, with hiring practices, with the curriculum, with real estate empires, with the relationship with the healthcare industry, settle on computational infrastructure because of how valuable it is to universities as they get increasingly meshed with the Pentagon and with large corporations that are erecting these pipelines into both. These occupations are also important to think about because these acts of sabotage went forward without arrest, and they went forward without punitive measures from the university. They also were able to win major concessions that led to the erecting of Black Studies programs, specifically in the case of Pitt and UCSB, right? So, pulling back or coming to this, to emphasize again, it's in the late 60s, right, where we're seeing students come to a greater awareness of the role that universities are playing in perpetuating U.S. imperialism. It's also the same time where the Pentagon is coming in and trying to erect close ties and cultivate close ties with these universities to provide them with infrastructure and funds for research and pipelines to join them in this or that war effort to come. And we're also seeing that the universities are places where students, despite all this money flowing in towards military-aligned projects, are getting left behind in workplace conditions, getting left behind in financial aid, getting left behind in housing, getting left behind in protection from racism in classrooms and admission policies in every walk of life. And so they're able to link and create links between these struggles because of how valuable the computational infrastructure is to the university's financial interest, to its political interest, and to its presentation to both industry and the Pentagon as some sort of temple for the future, right, or some sort of symbol of the future. I think then, from there, Larson kind of talks about the technology of computer destruction itself. That sabotage, one of the barriers to entry, or even to engaging or entertaining the idea of sabotage, is that there are a few constraints on the saboteur. One is, this idea that you have to have a deep familiarity with the technical system to be able to sabotage it. As he writes, the widespread myth that computers were too complicated for ordinary people to understand had insulated the computing industry from virtually all criticism by ensuring that the only people empowered to assess and respond to the social consequences of computation were the artificial intelligentsia, or the very class of experts most invested in computation's continued existence. Thus, it was not a question of whether saboteurs were justified in their actions, but whether they possessed the prerequisite expertise. If they did not understand computers on a technical level, then they were not qualified to decide how these highly technical devices should be used. And this is a constraint that can be sidestepped simply by ignoring it, right? And pushing forward anyway. That, as I laid out earlier, these computer center takeovers are proof that you do not need to have explicit and deep technical knowledge of the technical system itself. What you do need to have is some sense of why that should be a target, why that should be a hostage, as well as some sense of the vulnerabilities that the system might have. And this vulnerabilities can be technical, but they can also be systemic. Why is the institution itself specifically concerned with preserving or this piece of equipment? Why is it anxious about it? What can, in what ways can that relationship be disrupted to force them to the table for this or that campaign? The second constraint here deals with, a little bit of what I just articulated, in that you need to know the vulnerabilities of these systems. You need to have a sense that, in one example that's given, someone shoots a computer with a gun. And Austin talks about how, this is a kind of this is stupid, and naive, because shooting the computer with a gun doesn't actually do anything. Whereas if they had targeted records, as the people at Sir George Williams University had done, that would do more damage. It's trivial to replace the hardware and much harder to replace some of the records or some of the actual information encoded on other artifacts in these rooms and in these centers when they're being taken over. There's also an attempt that goes on during the 60s to try to more explicitly build an actual manual, an actual technology, actual praxis around sabotage. There are efforts to target and speak to dissatisfied persons, right, and offer them guidance on ways in which you can engage in little acts of rebellion and sabotage, whether that be fucking up the punch cards used for billing statements, whether that, which is called a computer card roulette, whether that be, demagnetizing checks, whether that be overpaying utility bills, whether that be inserting magnetized strips into outgoing mail, whether that be, screwing with the company's subscriptions, as well as infiltrative tactics like, befriending and quote, eventually shaming and demoralizing members of the data processing industry. But the most widespread article that Larson hones in on is called The Technology of Computer Destruction, which goes beyond harassing these computerized systems and talks about the outright destruction of mainframes. And it comes with, and I'll just quote them at length right here. The article consisted of an authoritative list of do's and don'ts, advising in particular against empty displays of brute force. An axe is not an effective weapon against a computer, the anonymous author explained, and one should not waste time bludgeoning transformers, fans, and other bulky items. Instead, aspiring saboteurs could maximize destruction through subtler maneuvers, scoring surfaces of magnetic disc with knives, taking a metal file to read write heads, puncturing core memory with a blunt object, stealing portable circuit cards, clipping electrical wires, and of course, punching superfluous holes in punch cards. And this is, this technology of computer destruction gets circulated underground largely, with pieces eventually finding their way into excerpts eventually finding their way into the Wall Street Journal, warning people about this new wave of militant Luddites. But here, the real value of this, of advocating for a technology of computer destruction, is to distinguish it from what critics might say is a negation of technology, right? The target is technology in of itself, right? That the concern here, as Larson writes, it was suggested that there was or could someday be a sophisticated branch of knowledge specific to the practical social relations that link saboteurs and their machines. Not computer science, not even computer hacking, but computer destruction, a form of technical expertise from below, so to speak, that could bridge the theory and practice of computer-centered sabotage. And one of the more famous examples, or probably the most famous example, maybe, or much public-facing example, was in 1970, where you have Syracuse University running a semester-long workshop called Computer Automated Disruption, where once a week for 15 weeks, students come together and they discuss motives, potential consequences, hypothetical methods, all for disrupting these data processing systems at organizations. As a result, you start to see the development of courses, specifically one called Humanities 480, that tries to push forward the theory and practice of nonviolence, that spends a lot of time focused on nonviolent property destruction of computational infrastructure. But you start to also see a discourse between the private sector and some of the people involved around this. And one business executive sends a letter to Computer World asking how can Hamilton Armstrong Jr., this is the leader of the course, himself a professional, not present his students with a challenge to improve that which they find wrong. In other words, why don't they join the industry? Why don't they work from the inside to change and reform it? 2 minutes? Okay. And the problem with this here is that, here it kind of highlights that he is, by pushing them towards sabotage, issuing a sort of challenge, right? The idea here is trying to get them to improve upon what they find wrong by destroying it, right? That they, by learning a bunch of computer-related techniques that can be aimed at the industry and the society itself, that there might be a chance to interrupt tech progress and, as a result, articulate alternate ways of advancing or improving society that don't require mindless pursuit of technology as an end in of itself, for its own sake. Since I don't have too much time yet, I'll zoom forward to kind of like some of the final insights from the essay, and then I'll respond to the essay itself. One part I want to quote at length. He says, "What makes computer-centered sabotage valuable, then, is how it re-articulates two key progress narratives where they have intersected and more often failed to intersect in the post-war university. On the one hand, in the 1960s, we saw major technical advances on university campuses, the near-universal adoption of computing, the rise of time-sharing, and the ARPANET, and the outreach to non-technical users through developments such as basic programming language. On the other hand, the 1960s witnessed massive social gains on university campuses, greater integration among far greater numbers of non-white students and faculty, the creation of the first Black and ethnic studies programs, and academies' only concerted divestment of military contracts since World War II. There was no obvious causal link between these two strains, at least not in the direct sense that the availability of computers inspired administrators to hire more non-white faculty. But these strains were not wholly independent either. As we have seen, they converged in various instances on computer sabotage, where students advance one strain by actively diverting the other. This does not mean blowing up a computer was inherently anti-racist or anti-imperialist, just the opposite. At a moment where the connection between Black studies and computers was anything but inherent, saboteurs took the university's immense intellectual, financial, and ideological investment in computing and chose to connect it directly with their own positions as members of the university community. They did not merely to discover or unmask this point of contact between computing, race, and empire. They created it. And to push forward, I guess, in some thoughts that I guess I'll end on, but that I was interested in connecting with these other texts, to think of sabotage as integral to technological criticism, because it enriches it by connecting it to these other struggles. It creates space that serves as a staging ground for non-computational grievances to be linked with computational ones, and spaces that contest whether technological progress and social progress are hand in hand. as well as providing spaces that allow us to articulate a theory and technology of sabotage, expertise from the bottom that allows anyone and everyone to join in. That sabotage is also integral if we're interested in imposing risk and costs that force the hands of targets, especially if sabotage is serving as a more radical flank to achieve other ends. That sabotage is also integral because the creation of that space and the creation of these risks and cause bolster the linked movements. They create greater solidarity, they can sharpen the analysis of all of them, and as well as unveiling and unmasking new targets for direct action. And that sabotage is integral if we are asking what forms or designs our technology should take, because it is easy to imagine that there are instances where the principles we desire not to humanize various technologies, but to eradicate them entirely. And in those instances, we can and should articulate those demands alongside the sabotage of them, or the sabotage of this computational infrastructure. So I will end there.
Edward, sorry, we're gonna open it up for questions if y'all both like to sit. Thank you so much for that. I'm like super fired up now. So thank y'all so much, and I'll give you this mic. Oh, y'all have a couple? Okay. And we're also set up for questions on Zoom, so if anyone has any questions, just put them in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll get those pulled up. Anyone in the room first?
My question is for Edward. Like, it was very difficult for me to formulate the question as you were talking, because I knew I had a question, but then I didn't know what it was until the very end, and it like came to me. But my brain is like so wired right now, so I'm just hoping I can articulate this properly. But you mentioned with the students and how they were acting that there were no punitive measures or arrests, and I don't know if this is linked to the fact that they were able to force the hand of the university, but it, you know, a lot of what you said made me think about the Fees Must Fall movement and the Fall List movement that we had at South African university campuses, and I'm not sure like how much you know about those movements, but the students were acting, you know, they were fighting for like free education and decolonization and lots of different things, and you know, unfortunately there were a lot of punitive measures that followed and arrests and stuff. So I guess my question is, like, when there are those measures in place, like how does that affect the sabotage or the possibility for it? And then like, is it still possible? And if so, like, how does it look then? And is it like, can you still force the hand? Like, you know, I'm wondering about when these forces of power are a bit different, like how that will transpire.
Yeah, no, I think in the later parts or in other parts of this that I've been thinking about, you know, one thing is, you know, you're right, there's a huge risk of state repression in any action you do, but, you know, that risk is only going to get worse as a lot of these issues become more salient. You know, I think climate change is a good case study to think about here, where, you know, as it becomes more and more clear that the solutions and the compromises we're being offered are far from the mark of what we need, but are still well within the realm of ensuring there's going to be profit and some measure of livelihood for whoever's left, there has also come down the pipeline stricter and stricter punishments for engaging in resistance and activism. And I think that the risk have always been there in any of these movements, in any of the nonviolent movements, even when you do not do property destruction, and even when you do not do sabotage, the risk of arrest and death, or framing, or being ostracized, or losing your career, and so on and so forth, are always present. With computational infrastructure, I think there are some opportunities in how much of the vulnerabilities can be tackled without, or can be tackled in ways that might allow someone to hopefully avoided, but also that there's a wide range of actions now because of how deeply integrated these things are in our daily lives, that it does not need to just be, if I can't, attack some data center in Virginia, then it's nothing. There are, to use a concrete example, right? Let's say you're organizing at a university that's also interested in divestment from Israeli apartheid. A lot of universities, let's take Columbia University in New York City, where there's been a lot of organizing around this. A lot of these universities also are incredibly not transparent with their financial dealings and with the real estate holdings that they have. And there are also struggles that are going on to try to shed light on those, to win back land or to organize so that there's better pay for student workers or more compensation or better working conditions. It's not hard to imagine how getting in to the university, maybe liberating some of that information would go a long way in helping all of these struggles altogether. And that, stealing information and leaking it is like one way in which you could do sabotage involving computation, right? That it doesn't always have to be we're targeting a piece of infrastructure that puts us at severe risk, especially if you're going to render it inoperable. It could also be if we're interested in radicalizing or sharpening our analysis and broadening the base of support, we can engage in tools, in computer sabotage or in technical sabotage that shows more and more people why their struggle is one and the same.
Hi, thank you both so much. Very thought-provoking talks. I have a question for each of you. So for Daniel, I'm wondering, when you speak about, you said, it is possible to make these jobs healthier, it's possible to make them less painful and traumatic for the workers. I'm wondering, from your perspective, if you feel like there are specific things that you can do to kind of reform the job, where you give them, I don't know, better psychological support, for example, or working hours, etc., or if there's something about the nature of the job and the scale of the amount of content moderation that needs to be done, that means that we don't just need to change the working conditions, but the type of requirement that there is, or the context that the workers are working in. So for example, if content moderation for a network of this scale is just incompatible with being able to moderate it in a healthy way, or if you feel like there's a way to reform it. I don't know if that is a clear question. And then another question for Edward. I actually have so many thoughts about this as a current NYU student organizer who spent months, fighting the university over putting up stickers because that was vandalism. However, I am curious because I did read Ali's blog piece last week and I spent a lot of time thinking about it. And I'm curious, when you talk about computer sabotage, what you're thinking of as kind of primary targets, because I feel like there's a lot of different types of sabotage that you mentioned. So one is the computer as a means to an end. So it's the organization is complicit in some sort of violence that may or may not be through the technology, but the technology is a good bargaining chip or a good thing to take hostage. Another is the technology itself is complicit. So say Google Cloud being used by the Israeli military, for example. And a third is a more meta concern with the rate of technological progress, and I think that's kind of part of what Ali was talking about as well, with regards to wanting to stop the scale and rate of how these AI technologies are being built. And I'm just wondering what you're thinking of as a priority or a target.
Is this on? Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, at a simpler level, for the purposes of content moderation, yes, content moderation can be fixed and it can be made to be much more safer. First of all, I speak of professionalizing content moderation. Why? Because right now it is done in a manner that is very unprofessional. And unprofessional because each and every single company whose business model actually depends on content moderation does it in its own way. There's no consensus in terms of what is the better way of doing content moderation. Is there even a better way of of doing content moderation? Well, I propose that there is a better way. So I have a lot of systems in mind when I speak about this. But one example I could make is that of having specialists within content moderation. And this is at the very basic level where we are not even talking about what kind of generic or universal system can we use that is safer for content moderation. First of all, we need to accept that, or acknowledge that not all human content moderators actually suffer from PTSD or trauma and all of those things. In content moderation, you find two kinds of people. You find people who have a higher tolerance for toxic content and people with a lower tolerance for such, right? The mistake becomes whereby these companies actually take a person with a lower tolerance to moderate toxic content. Because if you do that, you are potentially going to cause that person to suffer from PTSD. So imagine if you are a person who basically does not love horror movies, and then you get forced to watch horror movies. You are going to have nightmares, right? Now, if you are a person with a lower tolerance for toxic content, and then you get forced to moderate or provide training data for AI by moderating toxic content, you're going to end up with PTSD, which is what happened to me. If I was someone who had a higher tolerance for toxic or graphic content, I imagine that I wouldn't have necessarily suffered from PTSD. But here I'm not suggesting that we get rid of psychologists and mental health care professionals who take care of this people. Because here's the thing, even if you do have a higher tolerance, you will burn out at some point. So it is important that we still maintain that. But I'm saying, as one of the systems that needs to be implemented, one, we need to make sure that we have specialists, right? We need to have a system for determining or finding these specialists when we recruit content moderators. And this should be something that is built within a training system when I speak of professionalizing content moderation. Because right now as it stands, you simply go on the street, you find someone who can speak a certain language and click, there you go, you have a content moderator. But we do not have a training program that basically trains someone to become a content moderator, of which is why the system actually fails. You find a situation whereby a lot of content gets missed by human beings, and then it finds itself in the public sphere and people suffer because content moderators are not really that skilled in terms of interpreting policy to content and making the right decisions. And and the impact of that is such that if we're going to be taking or getting training data from people who are not properly trained, then the training data itself is questionable. Because now AI is going to end up basically making decisions that are problematic, and this bad content that we don't want in the public sphere will end up in the public sphere. But, well, that doesn't speak to the solution. It speaks about where the systems fails. With regards to a better working system, yes, I'm speaking about human content moderators who specialize. AI is able, we know, I'd like to believe that we all know that AI is actually able right now to identify different types of pieces of content. Not necessarily make the right decision as to whether that content is in violation of a certain particular policy or not. But it is able to know that, well, this material is potentially graphic, right? Now, if you have a human content moderator with a higher tolerance for graphic content and or material, AI can do the job of determining whether the content that needs to be moderated is of a graphic nature or not. If it is, then it must be, as a cue, it must be sent to a content moderator who, if it's graphic, it must be sent to a content moderator with a higher tolerance. Then you end up with a situation whereby the moderator on the other side who's dealing with this is unlikely, is not likely to suffer from trauma. But beyond that, there are other things. There's actually a lot of things that you can do, but not all of them are actually good news to the companies who depend on content moderation. One of them being what I call a pre-publication filtration system. So this is whereby if you are a user, you're going to be posting something, you have to basically fill up something of a form, if you like, whereby you say, well, this content is political, or it's a movie, or it's reality, or all of those things. Then AI gets to determine as to whether the content that you have posted is in line with the form that you have filled. If it's not in line, as punishment, your account can be banned or something like that, right? So those are some of the things that can be done. Of course, there's another conversation that we need to have with regards to freedom of speech and the protection of freedom of speech. What does all of this system mean for this? And at the same time, let us remember that when you post content that violates other people's rights, you're still problematic at the same time. So this is where I bring the question of regulation and the implementation of these systems. But at the very basic level, as an example, those are some of the things that you can do.
On the question of what are the targets, I think it depends pretty widely. For example, right now, there are the ways in which actions target and disrupt some part of the tech industry, like with the No Tech for ICE or the No Tech for Apartheid movements, are securing pledges to not work at these firms. Sit-ins, disruptions of events that are aimed at organizing recruitment of students, occupation of the offices, disruption of public events, or picketing outside their houses, and these are all great efforts and valiant efforts and brave efforts, but missing the link I think that earlier generations had, where you have these, and then you also have at the same time the flank to remind the people that you're pressing that if they don't listen to the very sensible or within their power to enact demands that you have, then there are like people waiting on the wayside to cause a cost that will deter investors or scare off investors or complicate efforts to further grow your operation. And I think with some of these movements, for example, that are calling on students to not work at these places, a good flank or a flank that might be possible is getting people to work in them and sabotage them from within. I think that we should, of course, not. If you don't want to work for these companies, if you don't want to work for Palantir, that's understandable. If you don't want to work for a company that's making a deportation machine at the border, if you don't want to work for a company that's powering apartheid in Israel, that's understandable, and you shouldn't. But it's also clear, increasingly clear, that there are very few levers to press on to push these companies outside of going inside and disrupting their operations because of how valuable they are in the larger constellation of U.S. security state and its priorities and funding initiatives or backing initiatives or blocking efforts to regulate initiatives. You're not, on some efforts or some issues, it's doubtful that we will see movement from the companies unless there's a real cost. And the cost has to be a combination of people not working for them, and then also if every 100th employee you have who works for you is gonna, try to rat fuck your operation. These are things I think are, those are kind of like some of the targets that emerge if you're maybe a tech worker. But the targets are also different if you're at a university itself as a student, or if you're a community member, right? Because if you're at university, then it's particular on what your company or what your campus's relationship with these firms might be, as well as what's the relationship with the government is, as well, or other governments or foreign governments. To what extent is divestment a strategy? To what extent is sabotage a strategy? To what extent is demonstrations and occupations a strategy? And also, if you're a member of the public, I mean, there are a range of options. Is it that you want to make your neighborhood not a safe space for Amazon Ring cameras? Is it that you want, to organize people against an attempt to bring in a data center that would poison the water or steal all the water in your area, right? There's a range of action in which the sabotage can be blocking the thing from existing in the first place, or not allowing fertile ground for it to develop or proliferate, to actually figure out ways to infiltrate or undermine or destroy the thing itself.
We have one other question in the room, and then we're going to take one on the Zoom. So go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much for the conversation. It's been quite interesting. So I have two questions for each speaker. Comrade Daniel, can you speak a bit more about the litigation? I don't know if you can, but of what's happening, where that is. I believe you have sued Samasource, and Facebook also has been pushed to go into that. So if we can get an update in terms of where that is. And secondly, have you had any chance to engage with traditional labor unions, whether in Kenya or here, both in terms of getting their support, but educating them? I would assume that's a gap that's out there. Then for Edward, I really appreciated your talk in terms of the fact that sabotage has always been there, but also your statement around if you don't understand how computers technically work, we're not allowed to comment on how they technically should work. And I myself would, when I introduce myself in a tech space, I say I'm a technologist that doesn't know how to code. I don't necessarily need to code in order to be able to tell you how this thing is going to discriminate against me. So I really appreciate, the sort of the presentation that you've had. I wonder, I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but I wonder how you see the link between sabotage and circumvention. For instance, we see. If I can give an example of, for instance, migrant workers in Colombia they would not be allowed to work for Uber or other platforms because they don't have the right documents. So I've seen cases where they would, I would sign up if I'm a Colombian citizen, and then I will sell my account to somebody else. They'll blow up a big picture of me, and that's how they circumvent the facial recognition needed, when they need to start the work. So how do you see the relationship between sabotage and circumvention, where, if you can't completely sabotage the system, at least can you circumvent it so that you get some money out of it? Yeah.
Let me deal with the union question first. So my experience with regards to traditional unions has been that, firstly, the only thing that always happens when you raise these issues is that they will basically express solidarity with you publicly. But when it comes to actually doing something that actually works for your cause or your people's cause, so to speak, nothing actually gets done. And one of the biggest challenges I think we have faced is the fact that we find ourselves as temporary employees as opposed to permanent ones. And traditional unions, what they do is that they, generally speaking, are interested in unionizing people who find themselves in permanent employment. So if you are not a permanent employee, actually, I once made a comment at one point and said that, well, the one thing that we need to do as workers first is basically address the problem of our own consciousness first. Because now, we ourselves don't see ourselves as workers because we are not permanent employees. We see ourselves as merely doing contract work and all of those things. And the other problem is that people within the A industry or the tech industry, generally speaking, don't unionize. You will find people who unionize, people who work for, who do traditional jobs, jobs that were basically, that dominated the third industrial revolution. When it comes to the fourth industrial revolution, well, nobody's really unionizing. And it's difficult to even think of unionizing when you yourself are not considered even a permanent employee. So in Kenya, we tried to unionize, despite the fact that we are temporary employees. But we suffered from what I call country hopping on the part of the employing company. So if I unionize, I become a problem for the employing company, right? And when I do, they're simply gonna, well, move shop to another country and start the same thing. Continue to employ people in another country. As we speak right now, content moderation, well, we know that content moderation in the summer stopped. It moved to teleperformance because of the court case and whatnot. That was stopped as well. And so Facebook decided, Meta decided to move content moderation to a different country, but under the same company, just a different country. So with regard to court cases, generally speaking, okay, let me start off by saying that I am not actually a fan of these court cases. The reason being that, for me, it's in the bigger scheme of things. I'm more interested in bigger fights, right? So in the bigger scheme of things, the court case, I think it's just a drop in the ocean. Why? Because let's say I win, for argument's sake, that case in Kenya. What's going to happen? Like, what impact is that really going to have with regards to the changes or the problems that content moderators experience in the global south? Well, we can talk about the global north on a different day, but I'm saying I'm more interested in the global south because we are the ones who are really suffering, right? So how is that gonna solve the problems of a content moderator, say, in Nigeria, while the case is in Kenya? Fine, the court case may establish precedent in Kenya. It's not really gonna help anyone in Nigeria or South Africa or anywhere else. For me, and it takes a lot of money and resources to basically launch these cases in different countries, even in one country. My case right now has been going, it's tiring really. It has been going on for the last 2 to 3 years. And in a space of 2 years, we have been arguing on the question of jurisdiction only. 2 years. We haven't even entered the space whereby we get to talk about whether or not the allegations that I'm making have merit, whether or not something can be done with regards to the demands that I'm making against the company or not, or even if I do have a case. The question is, well, can this court hear this matter or not? We have been talking about that over the past 2 years. So right now, the case, at least in my view, is still there because Meta is still taking this to a higher court, still on the question of jurisdiction, although the labor court said, well, we can proceed with the case, but the case is, technically speaking, is still before the higher court arguing the question of jurisdiction. And an unfortunate thing about court cases, this is why I feel like, for me, court cases don't really, well, in this context, they don't really, well, they work, but they don't really work. I'm saying this because my comrades who are facing redundancy and a situation that required immediate attention and resolution because of the nature of the wheel moving really, really slow, they ended up being fired anyways and not gaining anything from a court case. So as we speak right now, if you were to ask me about that redundancy case, well, it happened, and we are still talking about how they can be compensated and not how they can get their jobs back. Because when the case happened, the main fight was about making sure that they keep their jobs as opposed to them losing their jobs with the purported redundancy. So that's how things are at the moment.
You mentioned the types of sabotage and used the Uber driver as an example, and I think that's a great example in thinking through how, even in the talk, there are a lot of different types that are for different purposes that don't make sense in other contexts. The Uber drivers, when I was an organizer with Uber and Lyft drivers, you would see this sort of thing happen where there are arbitrary limits. Some of the limits imposed by the firms are arbitrary, and then some of them are a matter of preempting space for a legal case that would then rule, oh, well, you didn't put this limit on them, and so you have sufficient control over them and their employees, right? So, maybe to give a concrete example, right, even, part of the reason why they have this regime of algorithmic oversight and information asymmetry is so that they can pretend to be at arm's length from the worker, from the driver, and say that they don't have sufficient control as you would if you were an employer, while at the same time, because they're the only ones who have control over the data and they're the only ones who see most of the data, they can set the prices, they can set the wages, they can set the fares, they can set the assignment of work in a way that is much more atomic and granular in controlling than you might have as an employer. Or a traditional employer might have over a worker. And so there are acts of sabotage that the drivers engage in because at the end of the day, they still need to live and they still need to make an earning. They earn a living. And the arbitrary limits are not to help them earn a living. They're to help protect Uber from lawsuits that would cost them hundreds of millions of dollars because they're not paying livable wages. I can't work for both, there's a time you couldn't work for both firms or have multiple apps on one phone, so you just get multiple phones. You spoof the location so that you can be in multiple places at once and so that you can get advantageous, fares during peak traffic hours, right? These sorts of moves, I think, are acts of sabotage that are different from what I'm thinking, and that these are trying to make a do within a system so that you can still have the livelihood because of how little power and how little autonomy you have within this employment contract that's disguised as temporary work. Whereas what I'm thinking of is trying to articulate ways in which sabotage can be done so that it's specific targets that cause the most amount of pain without, without harming anyone individually other than the company or the university or the firm or the immoral practice itself. And that also are opportunities for us to build solidarity with other movements because they are in resistance or being oppressed by, being repressed by this university or this corporation. And all that to say, I think it is a type of sabotage, even if it is different, but it doesn't quite lean into the computational one because it's more of a workplace practice to try to earn a living versus an effort to make a company's bottom line scream or to make a university unable to stay away from the bargaining table.
All right, so we'll switch over to the Zoom.
Hi, greetings all. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, thank you.
Can hear you.
First and foremost, what an amazing event to be part of. This is just awesome. And I haven't been in all of it, but it's so refreshing to have this level of conversation regarding AI. It seems so kind of whitewashed, to use that term. And so big up to Vukosi and the team. I wanted to maybe just address 2 points and to both the speakers and just get their opinion on it. If Vukosi will know, I have a kind of, I wouldn't say it's a mission, and it's certainly not a one-person mission, but the issue of AI and its very term and its resonance as something so is so global and so all-encompassing, but it just seems so unnatural. How we come to a point where the very term AI, artificial, has come to represent something so poignant in human existence. And I just wonder whether, I know it might be, someone might say it's rather simplistic or semantic, that the very term and its resonance to use artificial as something that defines something so poignant, is it in and of itself something that we ought to challenge? I've personally thought of terms like complementary intelligence or so on, whereby the starting point in and of itself is something different, which you've both spoken to. So where's the intentionality in the framing of this thing in the first place, where we acknowledge and build systems that complement the human spirit? Artificiality doesn't come into that mold. And I'm just wondering, is that something that we ought to be thinking of as well as we kind of march down this road of inculcating a technological force that is here? We can't deny it's here. And the rebuilding of it, even if we are to rebuild it, how is it going to be framed, and how are we going to tell that story to our children? Do we give them an artificial tool to build their lives around, or do we give them something that complements who they are and who their communities are? So that's one point. I just wanted to get your views on that. And then I suppose the second point, which is to both of you, but more to Edward in lots of ways. And I struggle with this a lot. We're trying to, where we work, we're trying to build, in a very nascent way, kind of building in the kitchen kind of thing, alternative kind of platforms, networks, whereby, we self-host, we are more in control, and not say totally, but more in control of our data and so on. And what tends to happen with these amazing conversations is that we're still on the apparatus of those who we are, in effect, kind of challenging. And I'm just wondering, so for example, Edward, your treatise is amazing, and whether we're challenged by it, because it's sabotage, and we sometimes get afraid of that, it's an important part of the narrative of the strategies that need to be deployed. We need to have that, military wing, if you like. We need to have the intellectual wing. We need to have the culture. There's not one aspect of this to kind of challenge what's going on, if we're dissatisfied with what's going on. And so to the point I'm making is, where do we have that conversation? Do we have it on the public? And when you say public, then we're talking about, big tech. So public is now actually, it's a private public space. Let's be honest about that. Do we have that on the Googles? Do we have that on, I think I saw Otter AI or what have you, as a chatbot recording this conversation, having it on their server, and being able to compute what we're discussing? I mean, that's the reality of it. So our strategies actually can be broken, and before we know it, and we know how powerful AI is in being able to dissect what it is we are saying and talking about. So are we arming them by doing our strategic, if you like, machinations on the very systems, on the very architecture that we're saying, there's a problem with it? And if that is the case, is there a case for us building, even in small ways, 4 or 5 server systems, independent systems that we then start to build outwards in federated ways, which don't require us to be billionaires to build a system, whereby we can start to now, build communities around smaller systems that make sense for our realities without always handing over our data? That's on that level. There's a different level as well I'm not saying it's all like, a fight, because sometimes it's just a raw case of, well, they own all of our data before we even have a conversation as to what the economics of all of this is. I mean, it happened with Reddit. Who have their own servers and so on and so forth. Google said, oh, actually, we need your data. We'll give you $60 million a year to use your data to train our AI. So there's even an economic side to this, even if you're not getting into the politics. But if we're in the situation where we're on a Zoom call, which is recorded, and we know it's sat on somebody's server, we're not even in the game of being able to now utilize the data that we want to, that's pertinent to our cause. So it's a bit of a long question and some commentary, but if you can speak to that, I'd be very, very grateful. And thank you, and big up to this amazing, amazing event.
Yeah, I think that, of course, you shouldn't be on a public forum posting coordinates for the thing that you want to do, unless it's, there are actions that it makes sense to post online. If you're doing an occupation, if you're doing a sit-in, if you're doing a union drive, there are things that, there are mass actions and direct actions that, of course, you want bodies to show up. I think, though, however, your question is a good point. I think that we need to have the discussions, especially on the issue of sabotage, right? I've been inspired by this over the past few years by a few books. Andreas Malm's How to Blow Up a Pipeline, but also Vicky Osterweil's In Defense of Looting, which is a history of, it's a history that's trying to tease out why is there this, almost fetishistic insistence that if you damage property, that is about as bad as hurting another human being. And the history of how property right obsession and this attempt to make it sacred is developed in the United States, and the ways in which that's kind of like blocked or complicated efforts at resistance, and the ways in which you can re-understand rioting as not just the sort of mindless act of passion that we also think of when we talk about sabotage, but usually the result of buildup, of long periods of buildup, of racial tension, of discrimination, of all sorts of violence that then gets visited upon specific places when there are riots and looting. So I think that having the discussions in public, these sorts of things are important because of having these. There's a value to having interventions. There's a value to pushing back. There's a value to trying to convince other people a thought they may be having in private, or a thought that they've been considering, in the sense of how to articulate what a flank looks like, a radical flank looks like, is good, and because we need to be working on counter histories, because there's been a huge effort in writing out of the history the value of the flanks, right? The Malm's How to Blow Up a Pipeline is a really great history of this. It talks about how, slavery was abolished, because of violent revolt, that the suffragettes, went on this broken window pane strategy where it started because they smashed the prime minister's window when they were trying to get the right to vote, and they told the police, next time we're gonna bring a bomb, and then they just broke every single window over the next few years that they came across in escalating fashion, because and when they didn't get a constitutional victory for getting the right to vote, they just started a large campaign of arson of empty buildings to try to make life as uncomfortable as possible and impose a cost on not giving them the right to vote, right? The civil rights movement. There's another example where, in the letter from Birmingham jail has within it the warning that, hey, if you close the door on the nonviolent resistance, and if you ignore us, then you leave the door open for millions to join the Black nationalist movement. You leave the door open for riots and waves of riots. You leave the door open for resistance and bloodshed and violence that will lead to a worse path, potentially, for you than this compromise that I'm offering, the sensible compromise of ending the apartheid regime in the United States. So I think that there's a lot of value in having the discussions in public, because there is an atrophied sense of the history, and there's also there's a growing and increased need for it. I think of the news recently where where Google and Microsoft just announced that they're going to widely miss their climate targets, their mission targets, because they've invested so heavily in expanding their data center operations, and these are carbon-intensive operations and water-intensive operations. This is, you know, and the rationale for it is it's okay because we're going to do cold fusion. We're going to develop cold fusion. We're going to expand all sorts of green energy. So you don't really have to worry about it. But you do have to worry about it, you know. And I think that one way to also remind them, you know, to worry about it is to have these discussions, right? You have to be in such a comfortable state where you're not even worried about any resistance to say, we'll do cold fusion. We'll do the thing that everyone's been trying to do for decades and decades. We'll do it not only soon, but we'll do it in 5 years, is what Microsoft is saying as their defense for why they're heavily investing into cloud, into, you know, expanding their cloud computing and data center infrastructure at the cost of emissions. Imposing cost, having the discussion, imposing the cost, raising the risk, is not only to achieve demands at a table, but also to try and curb actions that wouldn't otherwise happen, that can only happen when they feel that there's absolutely no risk. And then to your first point about intentionality with AI, yeah, I mean, I like the example that I think the Georgetown Law Privacy Center has, where they say we don't use the word AI, because it's a marketing term. You could create a definition, and and there are people who do, of what you specifically mean when you are saying AI. But we have lost the war, I think, with big tech in terms of what the public thinks of when they hear AI. That I feel like it is a waste of time to try to rescue the term. In some spaces, it's not, right? If, you know, maybe if you're talking to a specific group of people who are aware of this, sure. But when we're trying to communicate, I think, with the public and they've conquered the imaginary, they've conquered the terms, they've conquered the images, they've conquered you know, a lot of the language that we use. It's all their terrain, and I think it's better to abandon it and keep insisting it's not real. You know, it's not. It's a marketing strategy term, and there are other ways to describe it that don't feed into their desire for getting people to mindlessly support it, or to throw money into it, or to buy into it, or integrate it into their daily lives.
Well, for me, I'd like to think of myself as an activist, right? Now, in the interest of activism, the term AI is not really a problem for thought, right? So what I'm more interested in is the impact of AI on workers. So when I think of AI, I think of it in the context of, or rather I think of it as another mode of production in the context of industrial revolutions. Now, how do we, this is the core, or what I focus my time and energy on, is, and this is in relation to your question of how do we organize? Well, if you look at how things have been happening throughout the history of work, and I think human beings exist to work. That is our purpose in life. Of course, someone else might come and say something different, but the kind of revolutionary justice where change is concerned that we want to see will only come in the context of work. And here, if I'm to make a practical example, I'm thinking of someone coming from my village in Kwakwa, who doesn't work in AI, who doesn't even have access to, let's say, social media, right? Is this someone that I'm talking about likely to be involved in conversation that relates to this AI and the problems that come with it? No, I don't think so. So the only time where a person is going to be able to engage or enter into some sort of revolutionary movement that will bring about change is when they are in the context or within the space of this mode of production, which is AI. And this is something that has been happening throughout history. Because human agency, I'd like to believe, that only gets activated when affected. It does not necessarily get activated when it isn't affected. So if I'm living in Kwakwa, a village, and then I don't know about AI or what AI is, or even I don't know anything about content moderation. As people right now in South Africa don't know what content moderation is all about. I speak on TV about content moderation, they're like, okay, that's fine. And then they move on. Why? Because they don't know what I'm talking about. They don't understand what I'm talking about. Why? Because they haven't been impacted or affected by this thing that I'm talking about. Which is what I'm saying. Human agency gets activated when affected one way or the other. So organizing and revolutions of change, they actually get activated when they get impacted within the context of work. Even someone mentioned fees must fall. And during that movement, I was there as well. If I was still in my village, at a high school there, I wouldn't have participated in that movement, and I don't think I would have known about that movement. That's the thing. And so if we want the broader society to come and be involved in this project, it means that we have to take the project to them so that it affects them in some way. And we will see the change that we want to see, and people participate actively in these movements.
Thank you so much. We have one more question in the room. Is that okay? Do y'all have time? Yeah, let's. Yeah. Okay.
Two questions can come right after each other, and if anyone had two questions, one for each speaker, just pick the most important one.
That sounds great.
Because I thought we were out of time. Great presentation, both of you. Quickly, I just have a question for Daniel, and it's about the framework for content moderation. I just wanted to ask if there is a universal framework or model for how you categorize content that are considered violent, or is there a sort of consideration for historical events like, let's say, last week when there was protest in Kenya? I mean, I saw a guy who was puffing fumes from a tear gas that was thrown at him. And the series of protests in Nigeria in 2020, end-SARS protests, where the state was denying it, which has been considered one of the very gruesome live-streamed incident of state operatives, shooting at peaceful protesters. So I just wanted to know if there's a consideration for historical events where some content could be considered educative, not exactly educative, in as much as they could be very graphical. And if not, does this put this big tech in a very problematic positions where they could be seen as being complicit in some of the, or being in cohort with state actors as perpetuating violence on the continent? I don't know if that's very clear enough. Yeah.
Yeah, it is clear enough. If I understand the question correctly, do we have a universal system of content moderation? No, we don't. Well, if you think about Twitter, X, Elon Musk. Elon Musk, for example, I think he's a bit of an outlier. And I'm saying that because he's one of those people who'd say, well, I'm coming up with my own social media company that has more freedom of expression compared to the other companies. So it says something like that, right? In which case, the culture of the organization will dictate the kind of content that gets allowed on the platform. So we don't have a universal system of content moderation. Facebook decides what kinds of content are they going to allow on their platform. Twitter does the same thing. TikTok does the same thing. But generally speaking, you find on a spectrum, you find those who are on the left and on the right. Okay, my way of defining this, I know it's a bit problematic by saying on the left or on the right, but basically I'm simply trying to say on opposing ends. You find the others who will take an approach that is more, for lack of a better word, that is extremely liberal to an extent that they would allow even problematic things and say that they are actually supporting freedom of expression by doing that, right? Whereas on the other hand, you'll find those who will say, well, okay, we are going to restrict certain types of conversations or speech or ideas because we are trying to protect society. And that is happening because we don't have a universal system of content moderation, of which is why I'm saying, if we professionalize content moderation, then we have a uniform standard with which to hold these companies accountable. Because right now we can't do that. If Elon Musk says, I'm going to allow Donald Trump to do whatever it is that you want to do or say, and then you have Facebook saying, no, I'm not going to do that. In fact, I'm going to suspend the account. Clearly you have a problem there. And that is why we will end up with a situation whereby you don't really know what to remove, when, and how, or why. Because we don't have a system that which we all can say, this is what we all agree to, and this is what we all want, and this is what we believe is good for us, which is why I say regulate.
And then Wes?
Yeah, so I guess I don't have a well-articulated question and I have a lot that kind of goes in between like both of you guys' conversations. But one thing, even with the question earlier from the person on Zoom, when we were talking about like maybe the definition of AI, and for me, I'm like thinking about, yes, definitions around the world, we use the word AI and how we use it, but then also thinking about like, what does AI actually represent or mean symbolically? And so for Daniel, like, could AI, I mean, I think you went partially there, and then you're advocating, I think what you're advocating for, you know, is smart and needs to be continued advocating, but I also saw in your imagination that there could be potentially the end result of all this, if we take the logical conclusion of a lot of this, is the end of work, right? Actually, we're talking about no workers' rights because nobody's actually working, right? And thinking about, does AI represent that, right? Or does it still represent a middle ground where people are being enhanced with work, right? Is that actually happening, is, you know, in our imaginations, right? And then thinking about, you know, this idea of sabotage and sabotaging the thing, like in resistance or in reaction, but also thinking about like, what is AI sabotaging us already, right? So thinking about like, are we being sabotaged with with its existence? And then thinking about like, does AI represent a thing that needs like these means of like extreme means of resistance or reaction, or and does it represent potentially, like, I haven't thought this more, I just thought about it during this conversation, does it represent like the greatest moment of extraction and exploitation that this planet has ever seen, right? And is that a reason for some of these thoughts or actions? Or do we categorize it that way, and is it fair to categorize it that way? Or could it represent the greatest extraction and exploitation on this planet?
One way I think about it is, I think that right now, capitalism is in crisis, and there, as a result, the frontiers of it, specifically the techno-capitalists, are grasping at ways to reform it and defend it and revitalize it. And one of the ways that they are trying to do that is hoarding and directing as much resources as possible into these digital algorithmic systems. I don't think that when I think of the threat that emerges around the digital economy, or that arises among capitalists who are at the frontier of the digital economy, it's that they are coming from a long line of capitalists who are engaged in this counter-revolutionary project to purge capitalism of democracy and liberalism, and to lock in a potential future where there are no alternative political projects. And that my concern then is that in a future like that, where you have liberated capitalism from the moderating influence, the minimal moderating influence of worker rights, of individual rights, of voting rights, of these threadbare liberties that we're not really that committed to, then you get ample room to experiment with older forms of hierarchy and privilege and domination. You can bring back eugenics. You can bring back, caste-based rule. You can bring back all these forms of domination and control that capitalists are interested in, independent of digital technologies, but that could be augmented and reformed and revitalized and re-legitimized with them in a capitalism that is free of liberalism and democracy. So my concern, I think that's in my head the reason to oppose and undermine and block off certain paths of development for digital systems is, one, because they are immediately connected to these really powerful and dynamic group of capitalists who are trying to save the system and make it permanent. And also because these systems are being used to fill in cracks that have emerged in the wake of previous counter-revolutions, of attempts to roll back the welfare system, of attempts to roll back public goods and services, of attempts to roll back labor rights, that are making every element, or have the potential to make every element of our lives worse, right? And so I think it's hard, to talk about AI, I think it's sometimes hard to distinguish when talking about it, because the threat comes from capitalism, but also specifically from a group of capitalists who are really ascendant and have a technology that comes out of a specific set of social relations we have now that are horrible. And we do not want their victory, because then they would use those tools. And you could imagine a scenario in some different social relation where computers mean something else entirely different, where computation is run entirely differently, where the resources are distributed entirely differently, where in that world I would entertain and I'd be much more interested in, what would a society-mediated by algorithmic governance look like, But in this one, it feels like a nightmare to me, because this is one where most of the history has been driven by people who want nothing more to have a system that takes as much autonomy from you as possible and gives it to other forces, and would be in a great position to do so with some of these tools they're trying to build.
Yeah, thank you for that. Can we get one more round of applause?